Hello, and welcome to the Nickels and Dimes Finding Financial Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Kime, and I look forward to bringing you amazing content each week that will provide you with a financial education. It will support you in your financial journey, and most of all, help you to find financial freedom. I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Nickels and Dimes Finding Financial Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Kime, and today I'm joined by Steve Kent, who is a good friend and business partner of mine. Today, we're discussing Steve's background, what drew him to financial services, some of his experiences over the last few years, and then we're really going to dive into 401ks and some of the other options that are available for planning for retirement. So let me tell you a little bit about Steve's background. He has had a 30-plus year career in IT, owned an education business, and now owns his own financial services company. His passion is to educate individuals, families, and small businesses so they don't make some of the same financial mistakes that he did. Steve has a BBA in accounting and an MBA in information systems. He also has 2 grown children and is an avid ice hockey fan. Steve, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks, Natalie. It's a great opportunity, and I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm excited for this conversation. So let's start with an icebreaker just to kind of warm things up. If you could be any superhero, who would you be and why?
It's a great question. I would have to go with Superman. Yes, we have the same last name, Clark Kent, but similar to Superman, I love working with people and helping them get out of sticky situations that in most cases was not their doing to get into in the first place.
I love it. I love it. That's a great answer. Okay, so let's jump right into the conversation, shall we?
Sure.
I want to talk a little bit about your background. I'm going to kind of open it up and let you kind of start wherever you want to start as far as your background goes, and then I'll ask some additional questions along the way.
Sure. So I went to college and thought, and I stress thought, that I was a somewhat intelligent person. So I spent a lot of time in corporate IT, went through several different companies, several different managers, and worked my way up the chain where I was working with some C-level people. And it was very rewarding, and I got to hear a lot of the inside things that were going on. And what I found was that a lot of these high-level people down on Wall Street, which is where I started out, were very into the corporate finance. And in the 90s, they're throwing around Warren Buffett's name and all these other people. And it was just amazing. And one day, I walked into this meeting to give them some information. And they were so busy, they forgot that I was there. So I sat by the door and I just became a fly on the wall and listened. And partway through that conversation, it shifted from corporate finance to personal finance. And now my ears perked up because now it's something I could relate to. And all these fancy people making all this money, who was saying their house was in foreclosure, their car was being repossessed, they had already tapped into their kids' college? And I'm sitting there and I'm saying to myself, that's me. Not to that extent, but that's me. And I don't want to get to that extent. And so I left that meeting and I started to realize I may be smart in certain areas, but I have no clue when it comes to the personal financial side. And as I continued through the 90s, I got hit, like many people, with the crash of '02 and then the crash of '08. And I didn't understand that at some point, yes, your money comes back, but maybe and when. And then in 2011, I had a personal loss. and my wife passed away, and I received the death benefit. And I went back home and I took my checkbook and all the mail that I had with all the bills for the 2 weeks that I wasn't home. And I looked at the two and I said, what do I do now? Now, mind you, I have a degree in accounting, but never practiced. My wife did everything. And I went to the bank and they showed me what to do. And I put everything in and bounced my checkbook and paid my bills. But what it occurred to me is, if what's happening to me is common, and I'm hoping it's not, but it turned out that it was, how many people are in the same position that I am, where we don't know what we don't know? So how much money is coming in? What's it being used for? How does it get invested? What works? What doesn't work? Who do you trust to invest money? How long will it last? All these questions and others are flying through my brain, and I was lost. And so a few years later, I opened up a education business with my wife's proceeds from her death benefit, and I lost it all because I trusted the wrong people, didn't know the right questions to ask. And it took me a couple of years to come back into the financial services field, where I had started many, many years ago, but made a mistake and left the field, but came back. And now I love helping people. And that's how I really got started. And that's where my bio says, helping people not make the same mistakes I did.
I love it, Steve. Thank you for being vulnerable and open about some of the areas you kind of tripped up, or I would really say you just didn't have the education really to understand what you were dealing with and how best to utilize what you did have, the proceeds from your wife's death benefit. Um, and I think you touched on a couple of things that I want to circle back to real quick. The
Sure.
first one is the fact that you had an accounting degree, an accounting background, so to speak, but no idea on personal finance. Um, as much as we know each other and we talk about, we work on things together and things like that, I didn't actually realize until I read your bio that you actually had a degree in accounting. And that's where your and my paths are very similar. I also have that background in accounting and finance from the corporate perspective, but had no understanding about personal finance in all of those college classes. Even with that as our area of expertise, there were no classes about personal finance to educate us. I'm actually reading a book, The Financial Pocket Knife, and that's one of the things in the forward they talk about. He also got a degree in accounting. And through all that time, he just kept thinking, why have I never learned anything about personal finance? And it really set him on that path to where he is um, in writing that book. Not only writing that book, but writing it in a way that the average everyday American can understand it because of the lack of education. And so we get stuck, not only not having had the education, but when we see things, we don't even know where to start. Right?
I am a firm believer, because again, my kids are both in their 30s, but I'm a firm believer, watching them years ago going through, grade school, middle school, high school. They were never taught the very basics of how money works. When I was growing up, and we're talking many, many years ago, but when I was growing up, the local bank would come in, and every week you would put money into an envelope. And back then it was 25 cents, 50 cents, because back then it was a lot of money. And they would take the envelope and you would get a statement back that says, hey, this is your balance. And you could watch it grow and you were proud. And when I graduated from grade school, I had maybe, I don't know, $15, $20. Back then it was a lot of money. And again, I'm 6, 7, 8 years old, but it started that process of saving. But that whole process went away. And kids now don't understand basics. There's no such thing as saving. I mean, I don't want to start the wrong train of thought here, but kids aren't taught basic math in school to begin with. They're pushed grade to grade without having learned how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. So as kids get through school and they get out of high school into the real world, they're already starting off on the wrong foot, being vulnerable to the major corporations that purposely want them uninformed because that's the way they make their money. And that's what we're trying to right these days.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I didn't even know they had a program back then like that. But I've talked before, on the episode to launch the podcast, telling my story about how, in home ec in high school, we had a couple of days where we went through the process of balancing our checkbook. And, then 30 years later, my son's a senior in high school and he's taking an economics class. And I think he took maybe one other, it was probably a mixed bag class, not like home ec, but something that covered various topics. And I think he learned how to balance his checkbook. Now, at the time he learned to balance a checkbook, I hadn't actively carried one for 10 years. Do I still have checks? Yes. For the great once in a while strange thing that comes up. But I hadn't actively carried one on a daily basis for like 10 years. And yet he learned the same basics of balancing a checkbook that I had 30 years prior. And in a lot of my episodes from the radio show before the podcast and now in the podcast, in a couple of the conversations, we've already talked about how you really learn your knowledge of personal finance in two ways. Whatever it was your parents understood and shared with you, and the school of hard knocks. And I think probably 90% of the education, if not more, that we get is from the school of hard knocks along the way. So back to your point, that's why that's such a huge focus for us, excuse me, in educating people. But the other point that you brought up, that I think maybe I need to make a note to reference more often, is that your wife managed all the finances. So when you got this death benefit and you went home and sat down, you're like, okay, so now what? Right. And that's one of the things that I talk about a lot. And I actually talk about it from the perspective of women whose husbands manage all the finance, in challenging them to not necessarily have a complete hands-on participation level in that, but to sit with their spouse and ask them to walk them through it and explain it to them so they have an understanding of what their household responsibilities are, what their bills are, what kind of savings or investments or things like that they have, and where all that information is at. Because God forbid something happened to their spouse, then at least they know where to get the general information to then get additional help moving forward. But to be a participant in, from an understanding perspective, but also a support perspective to that spouse that does carry that burden or take on that responsibility. So
there's one more aspect to that, which I just want to put in here real quick.
Yeah.
Part of it, yes, is to understand, maybe share, maybe not, but again, understand. But it's also a different perspective on what could be done with the existing income, expenses, and maybe other things that can be done. So it's not one person's point of view, it's now two people's point of view. Now, we all know, you've heard this expression, 2 + 2 is 5. So if you have two people together looking at something, you may get a much different, broader opinion than if one person looked at it themselves.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it's important too, when you talk about goals, that, as a couple, as a family, for retirement, like all the different areas that when you're married or you're in a committed long-term relationship, you're talking about those things down the road. we need to make it a point to have some of those goals and some of those conversations be about finances, and make sure that what you're both working towards from a financial perspective um, is moving in the same direction, or what you think you're working towards, right? You're both on the same page with that. So I think that's a good point that you touched on there. So you kind of touched on some of those situations that happened along the way that referenced in your bio, where you said, you want to help people not make some of the same mistakes you did. Is there anything else in there you want to add to, or specifically touch on when it comes to that perspective and some of what you run into when you're working with clients, that's similar to your experiences?
Sure. So one of the things I mentioned was going into business and not knowing the questions to ask, and that came out of corporate, because not knowing what to ask, it also extends to who do I talk to, who do I trust. So is that piece of it. Another part is when I was working and I was investing, people would say, or what I was told, that everybody was told is, you start a new job, here's a list of options to invest in. And they walk away from you. And you're left with this mound of paperwork with all these options, words and terms you've never heard before. And you're supposed to figure out in 30 minutes what you want to invest, what you want to invest in, how long do you keep it, et cetera, et cetera. And 99.9% of the people have no clue. Not because they're bad people, because they've never been exposed to those types of questions and terms and things. So I hit my first job, did what I thought was okay. I went to my second job and left my 401k and my retirement plan at my first job. Second job, I did the same thing. Here's a stack of paper, picked what I thought was right, stayed there a couple of years, went to my third job, repeat, repeat, repeat. But what I didn't realize until much, much later is when you leave a job and you leave your 401k behind, yes, it belongs to you. But whatever your objectives and goals were way back when probably changed.
Mm.
But they're no longer managing your money to your current objectives. The other thing I found out was, and this is a little off, but it's accurate, when you leave and you leave your money there, the expenses that are incurred to quote, manage your money go higher. So not only are you not having the return you want because it's not invested for your goals, but now you're paying more in expenses. So it's a lose-lose situation. Do that job after job after job. Now fast forward to the current day, and I look back and where is all that money? You lose track of it. If you even remember that you had it, if you can get that money back now, it's probably a fraction of what it was. And then the question becomes, what do you do with it? Because before I came back into this business several years ago, I received this package in the mail from one of the large brokerage houses. And it was, again, terms that, I had never heard before, new products come out, knew this, knew that. And it left me completely in a fog. And I'm saying, with my background, and I'm confused, and the mistakes I made, imagine many people who are in the same position that I am. And frankly, it scared me. So that's why I came back into the business. And that's, when I met you a bunch of years ago, and, we started to, have the relationship from a business perspective, and we're helping people.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I like the kind of jump into what our topic really is about today, is focusing on the 401k. And the reason that we're coming from that perspective is because for most people that work a full-time job, that's the savings vehicle that they're utilizing for retirement, right? It's the one that most employers uh, have a plan for, and they put it in front of you. And so if people are participating in something, it is most likely that. But there's a couple of things you touched on there. um, Before I want to kind of backtrack and talk a little bit about the history of the 401k and why it was
Mm,
created, because I know you and I had a really good conversation recently about that, and I want to share some of that information with people. But the couple of things that you touched on is that, number one, you get a packet handed in front of you, and there's nobody there. It's likely from your HR department, or nowadays, I think my last corporate job, it just all the information got emailed to me in my work email.
mm,
So I didn't even have a person hand it to me, but it's somebody in your HR department that oversees the benefits. And here's the paperwork they're supposed to give every employee to fill out, and then they submit it when they get it back. That is somebody who is absolutely unaware of what they're handing you. So not only do you not get training or an education about what the 401k is, how it works, so that you can think, okay, here's how this would fit into my goals. It's being given to you by somebody that couldn't provide that education to you anyway. The other thing that you touched on, is when we leave a job, and it's so crazy. Recently somebody worded it the way I'm about to, and it blew my mind that I walked away from my 401ks a couple times when I thought about it, how they said this. When you leave a job, you pack up all your personal belongings off your desk, usually in a empty copy paper box, and you take them with you. But we don't take our money with us, right? We leave it sitting there, and sometimes we don't even think about it. And I think that comes from a place of not really understanding how it works, and not being something that's front of mind that we're always looking at, because we don't understand it. Yeah, I might be able to log into that account, but really most of the time I was logging in just seeing if it had grown or not, but I didn't really know what that meant. And so I walked away from that a couple of times. And then, especially where you touched on the costs, that when you leave, your employer is no longer covering any of those aspects of that 401k you had. And so those costs are all rolling to you, and most people don't even know they exist, let alone what they can add up to over time. So those are all good points of focus we can circle back on a little bit more. Um, but they stood out to me from what you were saying. And I think that the average person that hears this episode, hopefully they're in a similar place. It sounds familiar to them up to this point, what we've talked about so far, what they do or don't know about a 401k. So let's kind of circle back, and will you share some of that information about kind of the history of where 401ks came from that we
sure.
talked about?
Sure. So, up through the 70s, most companies offered pensions. And the idea of a pension was that they would put money away, however often they did. And when the day came that you retired, you would have an income for life. It's similar to Social Security. And that was great. And a lot of companies had it, everybody counted on it. But in the late 70s, the federal government realized that as the population was growing after World War II, there was going to be 40, 50, 60 years later, millions and millions of people that were going to retire. And the government did not want to or would not have the means to take care of all those people, Medicare, Medicaid, and other entitlement programs. So they came out with the 401k in 1978, and it was sold as put money away for yourself. It's great. You can defer taxes, and when you're older, you'll have all this money. And at the time, it sounded really great, and millions of people started pouring money into 401ks. Well, a few things happened. Number one, companies realized that if employees were now putting money away, they no longer had to offer pensions because they shifted the risk to the employee. So that's the first thing that happened. The other thing, or the next thing that happened, was what people didn't realize is they're bearing the risk burden. So when the market goes up, their money goes up. When the market goes down, their money goes down. So now all the risk is on the employee. And yes, over time, the market, based on history, will come back. But it's all that time it takes for when your money goes down to come back up. At the very end, what they kind of sort of forgot to tell people was when you take this money out, when you turn at least 59 and a half, we don't know what the tax rate's going to be at that point. So if you deferred taxes, let's say at 30% in the 70s, 80s, 90s, but now you start taking the money out and the tax rate is higher. And by the way, the tax rate is going up in 2026. That means you're going to pay more in taxes when you take the money out, partly because of the higher tax rate, but partly because you no longer have the deductions on your taxes. Your house is paid up, your kids are grown, so you're in a higher tax bracket. So all told, you're not getting the tax breaks that you thought. You've bared the burden of the risk of the market. Is that really a great investment vehicle for you? And the answer, quite frankly, is there are other options that are better for you from a stability wise from the market and from a tax perspective. And that's why I guess we're here today to provide some options.
Yeah, absolutely. And all those are really great points. It's always interesting to me to look, and it's not just when it comes to a 401k in the financial sector,
Mm.
or the financial industry. It's in so many areas. The new thing will come up, and it's not that new things that are created or developed over time are a negative thing, but people get so excited about the new thing that sometimes they jump all the way in before they realize, is this the end all be all? Is this the total answer? Or is this something that can actually supplement or become one of the many tools in my tool belt when it comes to, in this case, my financial future, my retirement plan, right? And I think that's one of the things that is interesting about this is that, even the Ted Benna, who is designated as the father of the 401k, talks about he didn't create it to be a standalone, the overall answer to solve retirement for Americans. He created it to be a tool that was added to things that were already in place. And unfortunately, a lot of what we see is that employers now could do the match if you have a match in place, and still give employees a benefit long term towards retirement, but it was at a very minuscule level in comparison to the pensions that companies were funding over an entire career for someone. And it's interesting because I think in the 80s and 90s is, I think, where at least for me growing up, is where I started seeing some of my friends' moms also go to work. And when I got to middle school age, my mom went back to work part-time and eventually full-time once I was in high school. And so it was kind of this time in the world where we started seeing two income households. But I think there was also a big shift in the marketing around purchasing in general, right? Selling to Americans at a whole other level, I think exploded in the 80s and 90s because people had more money to spend because they now had two income households. And you started seeing those pensions decline while 401ks started increasing, and yet no education whatsoever for people before they stepped into adulthood or graduated from college and got that first corporate job. But also around that time is when you started seeing the transition of people staying at companies forever,
Uh-huh.
right? They wouldn't get that job and stay there for 40 years and retire. It's interesting that that is tied into when we no longer had a program that provided that lifetime income at retirement. Um, and how much those two go hand in hand. And I think sometimes that gets missed because we don't talk enough about finances and retirement in general. But that's where there was a huge shift in the financial industry. The late 70s going into the 80s. And then I think even throughout the 90s.
Well, I think part of that comes from the stock market crash of 87. When companies realized, and I made it through that somehow, I'm not sure, but I made it through that. But what happened was companies realized at that point that they could have the same productivity with less people. So all of a sudden, people who may have still had pensions were now out of their pension. People who started to get 401ks were out of the 401ks. Now people are left on their own.
Mm,
And now, to your point, in the 90s, the market was so good that people were jumping job to job every 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. And if you're going that quickly, yes, you're making more money through each job, but what you're not getting is your retirement. Your 401ks are not having a chance to grow and vest. So when you walk away to the next company, you're leaving behind a large amount of future cash. And again, in the crash of '02, the crash of '08, whatever you might have had, you bear the brunt of that. So while it was being sold as a good portion of your retirement, certainly not the full, as you correctly pointed out, what happens now that that piece is not as robust as it was? And that's where people are in between going, what do I do now?
yeah. And who do I talk to? Because even, I mean, in the world today, we don't talk enough about finances in everyday conversations. Um,
Mhm.
for sure, for sure. And it's funny, we'll ask our closest friends, do you have a good plumber?
Mm.
Here in Texas, the majority of people have pools. Do you have a good pool guy or a good lawn guy? Right? Nobody here wants to mow their lawn in the summer. It's ridiculously hot and
Mm.
humid. So we'll go for those things, but we don't have the conversation about, man, have you and your wife or you and your husband sat down and looked at your finances? Like, do you guys have a retirement plan in place? Who are you working with? Could you refer me to somebody to have that conversation? And I think that exists for a couple of reasons. One, now there are some employers who do have investment and retirement specialists on hand for sure. And kudos to those companies. They provide a resource where their employees can go and get that education. Now, I do know there's a lot who still don't because they don't know what that looks like or what questions to ask. But the fact that that's available with some of the bigger corporations out there, I don't want to not mention that. But I will say, without those conversations happening, um, I think there's two major things that hold people back. One, they're concerned about how much it's going to cost. And two, they don't think they have enough money to actually work with somebody. And so they don't even pursue it because they think it's a waste of their time, and potentially what little bit of money they may have it to even get somebody to talk to them. And so that's where we come in a little bit differently. I mentioned in a lot of my episodes that we have a no fee financial review, and we work with our clients without um, an hourly billed amount so that we can help that average everyday American get answers help them set goals, and help them identify where they're truly at. And I'll be honest, most of the time, or a significant amount of the time, I should say, not most, but a significant amount of the time when I sit down with somebody, they're actually better off than they think they are. But because they haven't talked to anybody, they don't know that. Um, but really, that's why we do what we do, and that's why we're with a company that allows us to help people without charging that hourly billable rate, because it means that we can make a difference for people like us, right?
See, and I'm sure you see it as well. I see social media posts, TV ads, everything about these large companies who are good. I'm not saying that at all. But the advertisements typically say, we will help you if you have $500,000 to invest, $1 million to invest. The fact remains, most people in this country don't have that. So if that's all they're seeing, who do they turn to? So to your point, who do they turn to? And
Yeah.
that's where, we can help people provide that, free advice, talk to them, understand where they are, give them options they never knew before. And that can make a huge difference in somebody's financial future or their family's financial future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if we can get to, the people we know our age, and through them be able to talk to their kids who are just starting out, the ability they have to create wealth with very little um, financial output in their 20s and 30s can be a game changer. And so
Correct.
yeah, definitely. I mean, we're looking to get that education out there. I want to talk about a couple more things and bridge a little bit as we kind of spend the last few minutes we have here together to some of the options that are available. And I do talk to my clients when they get a match from their employer, depending on what that match is, and depending on their overall situation. I'll say, go ahead and contribute up to that match amount and
Mm.
get that free money. And then let's take, whatever else you have and look at some other options. Um, but I want to touch on two other quick things about 401ks. And it's really one question: is it going to be enough when the time comes? And here's the thing, y'all: the average balance at age 55 in an American's 401k plan is $208,000. The average balance at age 65 is $233,000. Now, mind you, for the average American to think I have an account with almost $250,000 in it is significant. Like, that makes sense that that's a significant amount. But you've got to turn the tables around and look at how many years do you need to live off of that. And with the ups and downs of the markets, and you touched on this a little bit already, if you're getting ready to retire in 2026 and in 2025, you lose 40% of your life savings in your 401k, your choice to retire could mean that money's gone forever. And so therefore you continue working well into retirement to allow for that money to grow back. And so, but not only that, I've got a friend who had over $300,000 in his 401k and thought he had it made. But then when he sat down and thought about, what do I want life to be like in retirement?
Mm.
I'm going to be drawing he makes about or made about $250,000 a year. And he didn't need that level of income in retirement, but he thought, at least 100,000. And then it dawned on him with simple math, he had 3.5 years, 3.5 years over a 25-year career that he put in already. And he thought, something's broken here. Something isn't working right. And so that's another reason we want to come in. It's definitely a 401k can be a fantastic tool in your tool belt, like I mentioned before, but it's not a standalone product, and there are very few instances where a 401k could ever fully support somebody entirely throughout retirement. So let's talk a little bit about some of those other options.
So what I was taught, retirement on a high level it's a three-legged stool. It's Social Security, personal savings, and a pension. Now, if the pension, for the most part in corporations, has gone, only 19% of people still get a pension. Can you create a self-funded pension that allows you to receive income for life as long as you live, guaranteed not to outlive your money? And the answer is yes. And that's something called a fixed indexed annuity, where a certain amount of money goes in, shielded from market downturns, but is guaranteed to last as long as you live. And if you happen to pass before you receive all the money you put into it, it goes to your beneficiary. So it's a no lose tool to help you have income for life. Because to your point before, your friend, 3.5 years, your 401k is gone. Then what do you do? But in a fixed index annuity, it lasts as long as you live. So that's one of the tools that we suggest for people. The great part, no medical required. So if for some reason you're not in the best of all health, it doesn't matter. You can still put money in and still draw down as long as you need it. And that's one of the tools that, again, that we use. There's another tool that we use. It's called an LIRP, commonly known as Life Insurance Retirement Plan. People don't want to talk about life insurance because everybody's afraid of mortality, myself included. However, my personal experience, yes, I collected the death benefit for my wife, but I used that money to help my life financially. And with the new types of plans that are out there, you can get living benefits. So you don't have to wait until something happens to you for your family to collect. You can draw down for income if you need to supplement other retirement options, chronic illness, critical care illness, long-term care can all be add-ons to that policy. So it becomes a living benefit, but unlike a fixed index annuity, you do have to qualify for this. And for that, you do need a licensed professional like Natalie and myself to sit down, help you, and customize it. But it's something that more and more people are starting to realize, that there are benefits to this. So that three-legged stool has multiple variations where most people are not aware. And that's where we can come in and help.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate you touching on that. There's a couple of things from that I think are important to look at too is, when do you want to retire? Right? So let's talk about that for a second. I think for most people in their mind, they default to 65, right? That's what everybody says, you retire. And there's a couple of things there. One, a lot of people will say, well, my 401k will do pretty good, and then I'm also going to get Social Security. Well, let's be real. You know, they've been talking for decades about when Social Security is going to run out. And they pull this trigger or that trigger, and it extends a little bit longer and a little bit longer. Um, I wouldn't hang my hat on Social Security. Now, may it still exist in the future? Yes, it may. But could it be greatly reduced? Yes, it could. And it's because baby boomers had an influx of us, Gen Xers, right? Or I'm sorry, baby boomers. Hold on, I think I'm saying that backwards. So you have baby boomers, right? There were so many babies born. Then they have Gen Xers. Now, Gen Xers, we started having less children. And so those stepping into the workforce today and paying into Social Security are much fewer than those who are taking out of Social Security. And Gen Xers are just at that cusp of stepping into that retirement age to start to draw from that. So you have those two bigger generations drawing from and a smaller generation putting into. And so if it's already on the tipping point at any given time, it's only going to continue to become less and less of a guarantee over time. But I think a couple of things too is, there's a couple of rules that go along with um, variable accounts, which is where a 401k is. The money is in the market. So it rides that wave up and down, but there's a couple of rules that go along with those accounts too. And I want to touch on those briefly. The first one is the 59 and a half rule. So you cannot access that money until you're 59 and a half without paying both taxes and penalties. Well, what if you want to retire at 55? Or what if you want to retire at 50? That's where some of those things you were talking about, especially the LRP, is a huge benefit to fill that gap until you reach retirement age and you could tap into a 401k or a fixed index annuity that you have in place. But on the opposite side of that, I'm actually finishing up my parents' taxes today. It's April 15th, by the way, so they're due tonight at midnight. My parents' taxes are very, very simple now, but finishing up those today. And with each input I put in from their various retirement incomes, are these RMDs. So, Steve, I'm going to let you explain the 73 rule with RMDs on the other side.
So an RMD, a required minimum distribution, basically says if you have, let's call it a 401k, an IRA, or some other vehicle, the government says you must start to take a certain percentage at 73. If you don't, they will tax it at a 50% rule. So all that money you worked so hard to save and invest over time, and you waiting for those golden years, and you don't take it, they're going to take half of it. That, quite frankly, if it's your money that you put in, do you really want them to take half even before you start to take any money out? That's the RMD. So the 401k has the 59 and a half you can't take without a penalty before 59 and a half. And then again, on the other side, it's 73. So you have that small window. The last time I checked, wasn't it our money? Just saying.
Yeah. No, I mean, great point. And thanks for touching on that. I think we've gone into a lot of things about 401k. And again, we are not here having this conversation to say they're not a tool to be taken advantage of. What we're saying is they're not the only tool. And they're not the only answer that's out there. And so our goal is to educate people on other things that are available. And if we really were to go into everything and all the details about it, this would be the world's longest podcast episode, which we don't want to do. What we want to do is make sure that we leave a door open where you can get more information, and really, hopefully what we've done is given you enough answers or piqued enough interest that you feel comfortable in starting to ask some questions to put yourself in the best situation possible going forward. That's always our goal, is can we give some information to open the door and help more people have the conversations that can change their financial future for themselves and their loved ones. So that being said, as we wind this thing down, anything else, Steve, you want to touch on real quick, or any last little seeds you want to plant around this topic?
No, the only thing I would say, and to supplement what you did, be open to options. There are many, many different things out there to help you and your family, both now and in the future. And I guess that the last question I'm gonna pose out there is, in the end, what's the legacy that you want to leave? Do you want to leave that legacy where you left your family in a lurch financially? but you're the one who took care of them so they can live the same lifestyle you worked so hard to create.
Yeah, that's great. I always go back to, I don't remember who it was, but one of my mentors in the last few years in this industry said, you may not have come from a wealthy family, but a wealthy family can come from you.
Yep.
And we're not talking wealth like silver spoon lifestyle necessarily. You have the ability to control how that wealth is used, even once you pass, um, through a trust and some other things that we'll have more episodes in the future to touch on. But if you're one of those people out there wondering, can you ever retire? Are there vehicles out there that can help you? The answer is yes. And you actually can create a situation where a wealthy family can come from you. So, you know, the one thing we're putting out there today is Steve and I are available. If you have any questions, you can go to the show notes and get my contact information. Reach out to us. We would love to sit down with you and do a no cost financial analysis and see where you're at, answer questions about your 401k or any other financial products you might have in place. But most importantly, we would love to talk to you about what your goals are, because that guides everything. And our job at the end of the day is not to tell you what to do, it's to provide you information from an educational perspective and then show you options that can meet your goals and put you in a position where you can make an educated decision moving forward. And so if you have a financial professional, our challenge is for you to go sit with them and ask some of those questions you haven't asked before. If you have products with them that you don't fully understand, set up time to sit and talk with them and have them listen. Us financial people, we like talking about what we do. So ask them just to walk you through some of the components of the products you have and how they match up with your goals. But if you don't have that person already in place, Steve and I would be more than happy to sit with you. We work virtually all across the United States. And again, for us to sit down and talk with you about what you have in place and help you develop a long-term financial plan, there is no cost to you from a client perspective. So I just want to thank you again, Steve, for joining me.
My pleasure.
Sharing some information. I'm certain that I'll have you here again soon for another conversation. But I want to thank those of you listeners for joining in today on the Nickels and Dimes podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Kime, and I look forward to continuing to bring you amazing content each week that will educate you, support you, and help you find financial freedom. I look forward to having you listen and learn in future episodes. And until then, take care and stay safe.